Good afternoon and welcome to the Opera's webinar series. This is the sixth and final webinar of this current series in 2017, and the focus of our webinar today is on how to engage citizens in applying the ecosystem services approach. We have two speakers with us today, Professor Kimberly Nicholas at the Center for Sustainability Studies at Lund University in Sweden, and Anja Liski, who's a PhD researcher at the Institute of Geography at the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. And they are going to be talking about their experiences in the Opera project of engaging citizens in applying the ecosystem services approach. But before I ask them to address us, I'd like to just introduce you to the way you can ask questions, because your questions and comments on what's being presented are very important. If you would like to ask a question, you can see on the right-hand side of your screen a questions box. And if you open this questions box up and you type in a question, it will get sent through to us, and we can then pick that up directly after the presentations. So we're going to invite Kimberly to talk first, and after her presentation, we'll open up for questions, and then we'll ask Anja to talk, and then after Anja's presented, we will open up again for questions. So as you're listening to Kimberly and Anja, if you have any thoughts, if there's something you agree with, or if there's something you disagree with, no, what are you talking about? Then please write into the questions box. They come through to me, and I can then make sure that your question is asked. So once again, on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a questions box. Just type in your question there, and we will make sure it's answered. If we don't get to your question in the webinar, we've only got 1 hour, then an answer to your question will be posted on the Oppla website, so look out for that as well. But then it's my great pleasure, without any further ado, to hand the microphone over to Professor Kimberly Nicholas. Also, just to say apologies from my side, the building I'm in at the moment, we're having some repair work done, so occasionally you might hear a drill or a hammer, but I'll try to mute myself when I don't need to speak. But at this stage then, let me hand over to Kimberly. Kimberly, the microphone's on. Are you with us?
Yes, thank you so much, Martin. Can everybody hear me and hopefully see my screen?
I think that all should be fine. Yes, you might just want to put it on full view.
Yep, okay, how does it look now?
Seems to be a bit slow on my side. Maybe one of our administrators could come in here very quickly. Either. Very good. You're on.
Okay,
Kimberly,
perfect.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today on the webinar. It's great to have a chance to share some of this work. And I'm happy that Anja is also on the call, and you'll hear more from her in a moment about her work in Scotland. So what I'm presenting today is the result of a lot of hard work by many colleagues over the 5-year Operas project, which, as you probably know, was an European project that's just wrapping up now in the next month or so. I had the pleasure to coordinate the 12 exemplar case studies represented by this lovely graphic. And what we did in the last year really is put together some teams of people who wanted to work on shared questions around what we had learned from these 12 case studies, where we were testing tools and instruments and working with stakeholders in ecosystems around Europe. So I was coordinating the wine exemplar and getting a chance to work with colleagues all over Europe in many beautiful and special places that you'll hear a little bit more about today. And we have a range of products that we've produced there. You can see the link here for the PDF if you're interested in those, and I'll touch on many of them today. Hopefully, if you've joined the previous webinars, maybe you've also run into some of those. But today I'll be focusing on this question, which is how can we as researchers, because all of us in these exemplars primarily are researchers. And also as practitioners, we had several colleagues from small and medium enterprise, from non-governmental organizations who were leading exemplars in Barcelona and in the Danube, for example. So how can we find out what ecosystem services stakeholders care about? I imagine if you're on this webinar, you don't need to know the motivation for this, but just to make that clear, what we've found as researchers, and I sit in a university, is that there's a lot of research on what kind of services ecosystems supply. So for example, we know that in Mallorca, where one of our case studies is located, there are seagrasses that do a tremendous job of sequestering carbon, and that's a huge supply. But it turns out that most stakeholders, tourists and many locals, are not aware of this service and don't value it very highly. What they care about, one of my master's students showed, was clean sandy beaches and a beautiful natural place to relax with family and friends, and they're maybe not aware of the carbon benefits. So that's just one specific example. I'm sure many of you are familiar with others, but basically having this supply focus starting on the green side of things here and kind of going down this ecosystem services cascade, starting with what nature provides and then putting people at the end, risks that we focus on things that aren't really at the heart of what people care about in ecosystems. And if we do that, maybe we're not communicating effectively, or we're not focusing on the services that people really care about. So our goal here was to better link ecosystem service supply, what nature provides based on biophysical structure and function, with actually what people care about. So starting at this orange end of the cascade here, so talking to stakeholders and developing relationships with them and trying to better make these linkages. Sorry, kind of a busy slide, but just before I dive into what we found, I thought I'd give a quick overview of methods. So this was a collaboration as part of the synthesis we did with the exemplar case studies with people from 7 different exemplars. All the names are on the first slide, and then here are some of those who have, or all of those who have a profile in Oppla. But basically this was work over many months to try to put in a common framework what we had learned from our 7 different case studies in very different contexts and with different goals. And we did an email survey, which Anya helped lead and analyze, and I think you'll hear more about today, as well as everybody contributing to the analysis and carrying on with meetings over many months. So that's how we came up with this 8-step suggested framework to elicit demand for ecosystem services. So this is available as both a quick guide with 3 pages, just get to the facts, bullet points, and then a full document which we're working on turning into a paper, an academic paper, but in the meantime is available on the Oppla platform. So you have the links here in the slides, and we're happy if that's of any use to you. We're also happy to get feedback on that. But again, starting from the researcher perspective, and one of the questions I appreciated was, talking about co-designing research, and maybe the way we frame this hasn't conveyed that very effectively, so we might need to look at that better, because many of these projects were conducted with stakeholders that people had long relationships with and had been working for many years in the same community. Some were also new and had to kind of start from scratch. So that's also been some valuable lessons learned. But basically what I'll do now is, for the rest of the time, take you through this framework and what we found, and kind of trying to link the research approach with working with stakeholders and trying to focus on services that stakeholders care about. So the first of the 8 steps was to determine the study objective. Pretty straightforward, basically the research question or the conservation goal that we're trying to achieve. And I list them here for the 7 different exemplars that we worked with as part of this synthesis. And you can see that they really varied from mapping ecosystem services at the scale of the continent of Europe, to talking with local stakeholders in the Firth of Forth in Scotland and holding workshops and participatory design which you'll hear more about from Anya. Some of the work that we led looking at the wine industry, both from a large lit review with over 4,000 papers looking at what ecosystem services had been studied academically, to surveys and interviews with local stakeholders on the ground. So really a wide range here, and a range of ecosystems and a range of goals. But all of these were part of the Opera's project, and so we wanted a way to bring them together and compare them. So yeah, when we're looking back, I hope that I made this clear. So this 8-step framework emerged from the 5 years of work that the projects had done when we all got together and tried to share lessons learned and think about how we had worked and what worked well, and how we would want to move forward. So what I'm presenting now is suggested as a research design at the beginning of a project, but can also perhaps be applied to understand the stages that a project has gone through if it's already underway. Okay, so the second step then was identifying and engaging stakeholders. This was a major focus of Opera's overall. We've produced a lot of guidance and outputs on this, especially our colleague Jose in Barcelona, who has a lot of resources available and worked a lot with stakeholders there. Anya also has done a lot of work there that you'll hear more about. But basically here, talking about figuring out who are the stakeholders and who needs to be involved in your project, who are you trying to reach. Anya helped create this table here that shows some aspects that are important to consider in engaging stakeholders, both from how the researcher behaves, how to really connect with stakeholders, and having a fair and transparent process. Moving on, just to keep going then, the third step is to identify all the potential ecosystem services in your case. And this is where we were really grateful that the project leaders had decided that we would share this framework, CICES, the Common International Framework on Ecosystem Services, or classification. You know, any framework will have its pros and cons, but it was really important that we had a shared framework so that we could connect across these very different cases. So in the case of CICES, we have these 3 major categories of provisioning services that people consume or use directly, regulation and maintenance services like providing clean air and water, and cultural services, so non-material benefits that people get from nature. And these could look very different depending on the different cases. But the point was that for whatever case it is, starting with this comprehensive list and trying to think about how do these services, what does this mean in my case? So here was an example we did for wine, where cultivated crop, it refers to the harvest of grapes or leaves that are consumed, and cultural values might include the aesthetic beauty and inspiration of these landscapes, which people in our surveys told us was important to them. So basically trying to list everything that could be possibly relevant. Then you have to figure out in step 4, now that you know what services are relevant, and this could have of course, be done in conjunction with stakeholders. I think there needs to be iteration there. Developing indicators for those services. So figuring out a way to actually observe or measure or quantify or qualify those services. From the studies that we did, we found that this was a breakdown of which indicators we had used across these 7 exemplars that were part of this synthesis. You can see we had a lot of focus on regulating and cultural services, which traditionally in the literature are under-researched, so I think that was one reason they were a major focus in Operas. But of course, provisioning were very important as well. And you see the breakdown for the kind of approach that can be used to measure these different services. So some could be rating to compare between services or to list the top services. Some are easy to measure, like, or I shouldn't say easy, but possible to measure, like the amount of carbon sequestered, for example. So that would be a quantitative indicator. I'm happy to talk more about the indicators specifically if that's of interest. So once they've been, the indicators have been selected, you have to translate them into words. So, you know, this is where the interface between scientists and stakeholders is really important, because another one of the questions I saw was about how to work with ecosystem services without necessarily using the language of ecosystem services. And that's something we found was important in Operas, that, you know, talking with people about cultivated crops or the experiential use of plants, animals, and landscapes. Most people don't have a clear idea what that means or why it's important to them, but talking about how often you visit particular special sites, or in the Swiss Alps, how many farms and dry meadows there are, which are part of a characteristic landscape, that's something that people can understand and relate to. So basically, researchers care about the column on the left, the scientific ecosystem class, and stakeholders care about the indicators. So making a clear alignment between those two we found was really important. And then just using the terms in the indicator column with stakeholders was totally sufficient for our purposes, but having this common framework we could go back to and translate between cases was important scientifically. Okay, moving on to step 5. This was selecting a method to elicit demand. So now that we know what kinds of services are relevant and what might be important to our stakeholders, how do we find out from them and cooperate with them to understand their values? So this again varied. There are many different options here that we've developed in some depth elsewhere, but basically this could be a choice experiment, like in the case of the Swiss Alps, different kinds of survey tools, whether in person or workshops, or participatory mapping and GIS. So there are many different ways to elicit the demand. So then step 6, a little bit obvious, but of course, having chosen your method, you have to actually go out and do the work and collect the data. So run the survey or talk to stakeholders, run the workshops. Here was a case from the Swiss Alps where a choice experiment was done. So stakeholders were shown these pictures of their local landscape representing different options for future development, with changes in the numbers of farms and how many pastures or meadows would there be, and how much would avalanche risk change, and what would the change to taxes look like. So they were asked to choose between these. So that's one example of conducting the research. Getting towards step 7 now. So this was comparing and analyzing the results from the research. In this case, we were comparing between 5 different cases, shown in the capital letters here. And to do this, we had this Excel table that I showed briefly that we all filled out according to the CICES class. This could be very different. So for example, in the Swiss case, flow mediation would be avalanche protection. In Barcelona, it would be flood protection from the sea. In Scotland, it would also be having to do with flooding, but from the inland Firth of Forth. So what they actually represent could be very different, but we were able to translate them into some kind of common shared language because we had this CICES framework. And the petals here show the relative importance or the relative demand that the stakeholders that we worked with placed on these different services. And basically what this shows is that different cases look very different, and this is one more reason to talk to and work with and involve stakeholders, because without asking them directly, it's hard to know what their priorities and values are, and this is an important way to make sure that as researchers we're focusing on what stakeholders really care about. Moving on to the last of the 8 steps. So this is assess implications. So based on what we found in these different studies, we classified them into high or low supply of ecosystem services and high or low demand. And this was our way of trying to think about what was the current status of the ecosystem and what might be done about it. So in the case where supply is low and demand is also low, we're assuming this is an important ecosystem service. So the goal would be to increase the supply of this service and also to increase the public demand for it. So supply increase could be achieved through better ecosystem management or perhaps restoration, and an increase in demand would be perhaps a campaign or education or outreach with the local community. In a case where supply is already high in the upper right-hand corner, the goal would be to protect and maintain it and to continue what's being done, which is working, but to also increase public awareness and raise support for actions that protect something that is providing an important service, and so on. So basically the goal here was to get to a place where there's a high supply of important services that's well managed and protected, and a high demand for those services where the public or stakeholders recognize and appreciate the benefits they get from those services. So then in conclusion, using this 8-step framework we found was helpful for us in eliciting demand from citizens. It helped us identify common threads in these very different studies, and could serve as a basis for organizing future studies, and we hope that it's of interest. So with that, I'll just note that here in the slides, there's some references that are available to you, and I'm happy now to thank you and take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. We have 2 questions we'd like to pick up straight away. The first is from the United Nations University, Heonju-Roy, and the second is from Northumbria University, Alistair Scott. But we're going to move to Heonju-Roy first. Catherine, is it possible to open the microphone for the United Nations University, who have a question on the key factors to successfully engage citizens? Are you there? Hello, Heonju-Roy, are you there? You can either, I think we're trying to open your microphone now. Hello? Okay, we seem to have a slight technical problem there. The question was, Kimberly, for you, what are the key factors to successfully engage citizens? In other words, what are the motivations of the citizen to participate?
Yes, thanks. That's a really important question. So in this work that I've just presented, we focused on really the researcher's perspective. Anya will talk much more now about the citizen motivation. Is it something, Anya, that you want to address, or shall I just take it from my perspective and leave it for you later? But maybe Anya, do you have any thoughts at the moment?
Kim, why don't you go ahead, and then
Okay.
Anya can always pick it up during her presentation.
Okay, yes. Well, I think Anya has many more words of wisdom. It is something that we looked at in a separate paper that's part of the overall study that I didn't present here, which was about 12 steps for successful stakeholder engagement. And what we found in that study was creating space to bring people together, building trust, and aligning motivations was really critical. So we break those 3 things down based on examples that we experienced, but I think that's one place to start.
Hello, sorry about that. I just needed to unmute myself. Great, thank you very much for that, Kim. I'm now going to move to Alistair Scott, and we're going to try and bring the microphone to you, sir.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, well, my question is, I missed the start of the presentation, so apologies if I'm going over, but it struck me, does everything reduce itself to an ecosystem service? And I was wondering whether if you like, the overall things that people value is more than the sum of the services that are involved. And I was just wondering how you within that sort of, within your framework, deal with that particular problem.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. It's a really good question, and one that we've debated quite a bit. I mean, if I'm honest, I think there are limitations to the ecosystem services framework. It's not the right tool for each and every situation. I think it offers a lot of benefits, but especially when we started with open-ended questions, it could be very difficult to align what our stakeholders told us with the ecosystem services framework. So for one example, one of my master's students did her research in Mallorca on seagrasses that I mentioned earlier. And when we asked open-ended questions to visitors of Mallorca of why were they there, or what, without which services would they potentially not return? And for them, it was about quality time with family and friends. That was one of the top services, and that we found very difficult to map onto an ecosystem services framework. So I guess I can say we learned a lot from using the ecosystem services approach, and we found it helpful, and many of the things that we found stakeholders valued could be connected to or were well explained by the ecosystem services framework, but certainly not everything.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. I have one more question here that was sent in advance from Dara Carroll at the Dublin Institute of Technology. And his question is, what is the role of citizen engagement for the delivery and ongoing management and maintenance of ecosystem services and nature-based solutions, and particularly in urban areas? So how can planning processes accommodate this? So you've been talking very much about the research, but then for the planning and implementation, how do you see the role of citizen engagement?
Thank you. That's a really important question. I think it's critical. I mean, we can have the best laid plans, but ultimately you need public support, both in terms of potentially financing for maintenance or restoration, for example, but also in terms of respecting land uses as they're planned. So respecting conservation areas, for example. I mean, there's not going to be, we're never going to have the resources to sort of police every area all the time, and I mean that's also not a world we would probably want to live in. So you need people to buy into these things and to do so to really help create the plans and have an investment in it. And I think one really meaningful way to do that is to involve people in the actual ecosystem work themselves. So having people spend time in these beautiful places and get some, or deepen or develop their connection to them further. We've seen one good example of that in Barcelona, where our colleague Jose has created a program for local school children to help with beach dune restoration. So this is something that the kids actively go out and do, and they learn about the ecology of the beach and the pressures that it's facing from development and the level of demand that people have for using the beach, but also really helping actively create a better ecosystem there. And I think that's something that's a lot of work, but has a really big impact on the community and makes people feel like they're a part of protecting and restoring these ecosystems.
Great, Kim, thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Anya Liski, who's a PhD researcher in the Institute of Geography at the University of Edinburgh. And Anya, I think, yes, your slides are up. I think your microphone is on. So the floor is yours, Anya.
Okay, hello everyone. Greetings from Edinburgh. So this talk builds on my experiences in citizen engagement over the past 3 years. So I know that some of you in the audience are policymakers or practitioners working towards sustainable landscapes across Europe, and perhaps you're applying the concept of ecosystem services in your work. So the purpose of this talk is to reflect on why citizen engagement is an important part of the ecosystem approach and ecosystem services applications, and I'm going to provide you with some advice on how to do that effectively from my experiences. So this talk has four main parts. I'll first talk a little bit about why engagement is important, and then I'll share my research approach. Then I'll discuss some key ingredients to effective engagement of citizens, and then talk a little bit about how to apply this knowledge in practice. So let's go back first a little bit and think about why citizen engagement is important. So if we look at the 12 principles of the ecosystem approach, which is the primary strategy for the Convention on Biological Diversity, we can see that citizen engagement is actually really central to 5 of those 12 principles. So objectives of land or seascape management, their societal choices. Citizen engagement can also be important in determining the appropriate scales for management and kind of appropriate boundaries in terms of space and time. And you also need citizen engagement to consider local knowledge and to involve all relevant sectors of society when you're implementing the ecosystem approach. Let's take another example. So the IKE 2020 targets. So we need citizens. We need citizens to kind of increase awareness to mainstream biodiversity, but also to consider their needs when we're restoring and safeguarding ecosystems. And we need to integrate local practices into policy and practice. And we need to build capacity and increase knowledge sharing. So let's go to the local level on why citizen engagement is important. So now it's a good time to introduce one of the Opera's exemplars that Kim already mentioned, the Unifor. So this is in Scotland, in the Central Belt area, just north of Edinburgh. So this is what the Unifor area looked like 200 years ago. And since then, it has industrialized and post-industrialized, and there's a lot of farming in the area. This is what it looks like nowadays. It's facing unprecedented challenges with sea level rise and flooding. So one way to adapt is to restore the area shown on the map in blue back to salt marsh and mudflats. Another option for adaptation would be to strengthen the existing seawalls. But taking these actions to adapt to climate change in this area is difficult because many of the stakeholders in the area, including citizens, they're not aware of the issues of climate change on local level, and they're not part of the planning process for the shoreline. So here's just a diagram to kind of show my overall research approach. So this was part of my PhD work. So I had 3 main questions in my research. Firstly, how does governance support shoreline adaptation? How can participation in governance support the inclusion of different worldviews? And how can deliberation support kind of participation in governance? So we've been working with a range of stakeholders using different methods and formats to answer these questions. What was really kind of central to this work were the citizen engagement workshops that we organized with 109 citizens living on the shores of the Inner Forth. So these were 5-hour workshops, and we managed to get a representative sample of the local community. What was quite kind of an important aim for us, and that we achieved, was that 30% of our participants were from the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods of Scotland. So we had a range of methods that we used to engage citizens. So these included things like choice experiments. So there's an example of the choice cards that we used on the left-hand side. Then we had participatory mapping, we had listing exercises, and lots of discussion. We analysed, so we really collected a mountain of data from these workshops and applied a range of method kind of analysis on this, including econometric choice modelling, describing spatial patterns, and content analysis. So now that you have a better idea of how we engage citizens in the Inner Forth, I want to talk more specifically about how to achieve effective engagement. So we're going to look at 3 things. I'm going to share some tips on how to achieve a representative sample. Then I'm going to talk about how to make sure that people are happy with the way that you're asking them to engage, and then how to consider their abilities when you're designing your project. So if you're going to engage people across the socio-economic gradient, you need to connect with people in the right places. So for me, that meant stopping people in the high streets of the local town. And when you manage to stop them, you are competing against a number of other priorities on their list. So there's a number of things that you can do to kind of win this battle. So you can let kids come to the children to come to the event. If you want more women to participate, you can make it a very social event, offer a lunch, kind of make it into like a way of spending your Saturday. So you can invite people to bring their families along. A lot of people who have regular full-time jobs, they're only going to be able to attend on weekends and evenings. And you might also, a really important thing to kind of build the motivations to participate is to connect it with their personal interest and make sure that you link your workshops with something that they are already aware of. So for example, fracking was a major concern for people living in the Unifor. So we made sure that there was an opportunity to discuss that, even though it wasn't really central to our research questions. Another really important point is language. So when we were inviting people to the workshops, we didn't say it was about ecosystem services, but instead we talked about the landscape benefits and working with nature instead of working against nature. So that's also a very important part of kind of building motivations so that you get representative sample. So the second ingredient is about how to make sure that people are happy with the way you're asking them to engage. So the key concept here is worldviews. For example, you might be interested in managing landscapes and seascapes for biodiversity, which emphasizes ecological worldviews. But the general public might value these areas for how they support local livelihoods or their cultural importance. So this emphasizes more kind of economic and socio-cultural worldviews. So when you're engaging the public, do so using methods that allow for different worldviews to be expressed. So I found different methods to emphasize different worldviews. So for example, socio-cultural worldviews were best captured using qualitative and deliberative formats, whereas economic worldviews were best captured through use-based, spatial, and quantitative measures. So the final point I want to make about the effectiveness of engagement is about ability and learning. So in the Unifor, we found it difficult to talk to people about their local shoreline because they didn't know their local shoreline very well or the pressures it was facing. So we had to first address those awareness gaps in the workshops before we could have a productive discussion about local visions for the shoreline. So we measured people's willingness to donate before and after learning, and we found this to considerably shift the kind of distributions of preference. So when we kind of gave people an opportunity to learn about the local shoreline, this increased participants' confidence in their choices for almost half of the participants, and much clearer priorities for the area emerged. So how do we then apply this knowledge in practice? This knowledge that we've gained from citizen engagement. So I guess we have kind of broadly two outcomes. So you might find that citizens' values were well aligned with sustainability goals, or you might find that actually they're not in line with sustainability goals for the landscape that they live in, for example. So if you find that their kind of citizens' visions do support sustainability goals, I would say that the first principle in the ecosystem approach applies. you've perhaps gained some support, some supporting evidence for your work, so you can focus on raising awareness on how people can protect it. But if you find that what they want is not in line with the sustainable future, this 12th principle of the ecosystems approach applies. Perhaps there's a need for raising awareness on the value of biodiversity to kind of overcome barriers for sustainability. So how are we applying kind of this knowledge gained from citizen engagement in the Unifor? So we are actually now, next month, we're organizing a final discussion event, which is based on the research findings. And this is going to be attended by citizens as well as local landowners and policymakers. And at the end of this event, we're going to kind of bring together the points from the main points from the research findings, together with the main points from the discussions during the event into information notes, which we can then distribute to people who took part in the research, as well as other stakeholders. So my key messages on engaging citizens in ecosystem services applications is that you should invest in the recruitment, so you'll engage a representative socioeconomic gradient of people, and that learning is a really key part of engagement, so the outputs are credible, but also so that that process is more interesting for people to participate in. Also, it's important that you allow learning from both local and expert perspectives, so that there's time for discussion, but perhaps also presentations from local experts, and that you choose methods and formats that are inclusive to different worldviews, so that people are happy with the way that you're asking them to participate. So that was my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Anya, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. We're going to try our luck and see if we can get back to the United Nations University and to Heonju Rui, who I think has a very pertinent question also for you, Anya. But let's first of all see if we can get the microphone to him. Hello, sir. Or madam. The microphone is open from our side. Yes, we can hear you typing. If we can hear you typing, that probably means if you just speak, your question will come through. No. Okay. Doesn't seem to be working. Never mind. Anya, the question again, and I think it's very pertinent to you. You've described now that whole process of how you engage citizens, but what was their motivation to participate? You said at the beginning you were competing against them, going to the shops and all the other distractions. So why do you think they were motivated to engage with you on this research? Anya, the microphone is yours.
Oops. Okay, sorry, I had my microphone muted. Yes, so I guess there's two key motivations. So it has to be interesting enough, and it has to be pleasant enough. So to make it really interesting, for the participants in the Unifor, for a lot of them, the reason they came is because they wanted to hear more from us, what we knew about climate change risks in the area, for example, flood risk, kind of possibilities for adaptation, but they also really enjoyed learning from one another, having those discussions about their local landscape. So that's the kind of first factor. The second factor would be that it has to be pleasant enough. So you have to make it into a social event. So, for example, we had to organize the workshops on Saturdays because they were quite long. So we could have people who were working on Monday to Friday join, and it had to be an interesting way of spending your Saturday. So it was important to kind of make it inclusive, so they could come with their family, they could have coffee and tea and cake, and it was really a social event rather than a formal meeting. So those are the kind of two key factors that I learned from my work.
Excellent, thank you. We also have a question from Liz O'Brien at Forest Research, and she raises an issue that you've already addressed. How do you use concepts of ecosystem services when this is a terminology that a lot of citizens will not be able to engage with? How did you identify what the best terminology would be to engage citizens in Scotland?
So this was a very difficult question for us in the beginning, and to kind of overcome this challenge, we did some pilot interviews. So we tested different words and kind of listened to how people talked about their local landscape in their own words. And we also spoke to other people who'd done similar research in the area, and we heard that kind of the term landscape benefits had worked well in the past. So that's something that we ended up using. And also, when you are kind of introducing, say for example, if your kind of methods include, they have to read through a list of ecosystem services, make sure that there's time for questions and kind of time for them to kind of digest the information that you are giving them. So yeah, it's not also, so it's partly kind of adapting to local language, but also just providing time for kind of asking questions and what different words mean.
Thank you very much. And again, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening, just a quick reminder, if you have a question that you would like to pose, then please just go to the questions box, send in the question there, and we'll try to pick it up. But in the meantime, Anya, another question from you. This research has been going on for a while. It's been over a 3-year period where you've been engaging these stakeholders. And you mentioned in your presentation that you're about to have the last meeting in the next coming weeks. But what happens then? How is the data used? These citizens have given you a lot of information. What are they getting back? How do you see the long-term relationship with the stakeholders that have provided the inputs for the research?
So that's a really important discussion. As you said, for me, this has been my PhD project, and after I finish, it would be a shame if the kind of findings were not used in kind of local policy and practice. So to try to kind of overcome that challenge, we engaged, so we had a small group of local stakeholders from a local NGO, as well as the local kind of officer from a government agency, who have been involved in kind of designing the research and as a sort of sounding board on how they think that the project is evolving and whether they think that the research we are doing is useful. So these people, this kind of local stakeholder group, have been involved over a period of 3 years now. So we hope that they will be able to kind of carry that knowledge that we've produced even after my project is finished. So that's a sort of way of trying to kind of create perennity for your results, that you involve local stakeholders from the very beginning of your research project.
Thank you very much. We have a question in from Belen and Dara, and we're going to try and hand the microphone over to Belen. We're having mixed results with handing the microphone over today. Belen, are you there? Are you able to talk to us?
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask if already some of the results and some of the suggestions provided by citizens have been applied in local landscape planning.
Thank you very much. Anya?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So I guess this question is about whether we've had any kind of real impact on the ground. So for us, I'm not sure whether it's influenced any single decisions. I guess it's quite hard to also provide the knowledge at the time when a decision is made, kind of time your research findings appropriately. I guess what our findings have been used for so far is the fact that before the local kind of policymakers, they didn't know how citizens perceived, for example, the idea of managed realignment. And we found that actually they were generally quite positive towards that idea. And the fact that the local citizens appreciated the ideas of managed realignment for the kind of biocentric values, the fact that more space should be provided for nature along the local shoreline instead of kind of flood protection reasons. So there's definitely been some kind of interesting findings for local policymakers, but I'm not sure whether we've had any real impact on kind of single decisions. But perhaps if we make sure that our knowledge is kind of carried on by those who've been involved throughout the project, hopefully it will have impact in the future.
Great, Anya, thank you very much. I received a message from the United Nations University saying Hey Angel can't get his microphone to work, but he has a rather important question. Were the participants paid? And he also just had a couple of questions again on how did you contact local people and how many? I'm wondering if you could go back to your slide where you showed us how many people were approached. But on this critical question of were the participants paid?
Okay. I hope you can see my slides. So we decided to pay the participants a fee to kind of compensate for their time and efforts. So this was a motivation for, especially for some of the younger people, to participate, because it was equivalent to the amount of money that they would have been paid for a kind of day's work. However, many of the people who participated, they said that, okay, it was very kind for us to pay, but it wasn't the main motivation. So that definitely helped us to, so the fact that we paid the participants, it helped us to get more young people into the workshop who wouldn't usually come to kind of community meetings. So definitely, I also think it's kind of ethical to pay, as we were talking about a very long workshop. So this was a 5-hour workshop, and it would, for a lot of people, they couldn't really justify doing a 5-hour event without payment. And I know that some of the people who came, they used that money to pay for a babysitter or a taxi to come to the event. So perhaps some people could also come for those reasons. So there was a second part to the question. So how many people did we ask to come to the event? So this kind of recruitment success rate was around 10%. So this means that I had a little clicker. So every time I approached a person on the street, I would click. So that means that every 10th person who I said hello to on the high street stopped and agreed to come to the workshop. So actually, relatively speaking, that's quite good because very few people would stop. So I don't have a count of how many of those who I managed to stop then eventually came to the workshop, but I would say that would be about 30%.
Excellent, Anya, thank you very much. And we have time for just one more question. We're going to go back over to Alistair Scott at Northumbria University. Alistair, your question.
Sorry, I wasn't expecting that. I suppose it was the last one I sent because I made some observations. And firstly, thank you for the inclusion of the ecosystem approach explicitly. But the question that I wanted to ask was, and it, I suppose, borders on the policy impact. How is this? I see an opportunity for this work to influence local plans, which is a strategic legal framework within which development management decisions are made. And it struck me that, that there might be an opportunity to have planners or the extent to which you've worked with planners as key stakeholders in research, because a lot of research that I've done on ecosystem approach and ecosystem science, as I call it, planners are conspicuous by their absence within research groups. And I was just wondering whether you do actually have that kind of presence.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't manage to get any planners into my kind of local stakeholder group, which is a shame. We focused on, the people we involved were people who were actively kind of proposing changes in land use along the shoreline, and people who were involved in the local landscape partnerships. And as long as I'm aware, the planners are not a key part of either of those groups, at least in the circles that I've engaged in. So what you're raising is very interesting point.
Okay, Anya, thank you very much, and also Kimberly, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, special thanks to all of you who tuned in to listen to the webinar today. This, as I said at the beginning, is our final webinar in this series, but I hope very much that you will continue to engage with the Oppla platform where these webinars were advertised, and please do look out for the Oppla's platform for answers to some of the other questions that were posed for the webinar today. Also, Oppla in general, a great resource for people dealing with ecosystem services and natural capital. So please do continue to engage with that platform. But on behalf of the whole Oppra's team and all of the presenters that we've had over these 6 webinars, I'd like to thank you all very much, and I wish you a good rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.